Hey guys, tonight we wander through torch-lit corridors and drafty stone chambers where conspiracy theory was less Reddit thread and more life expectancy issue. We're talking about the kind of medieval plots that actually happened. Kings sweating under velvet, bishops whispering behind tapestries, merchants quietly funding chaos like it was a hobby. Imagine iron doors closing softly at midnight, wax seals cracking open, and somebody in the corner pretending they absolutely did not just poison the wine. Subtle, rarely, effective, oh, frequently. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where in the world these late-night history spirals reach. Now, settle in and get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the early 14th century, the most powerful secret in Europe did not hide in a dungeon, but in plain sight, stitched into white mantles marked with red crosses, because the Knights Templar had mastered the art of looking holy while functioning like an international banking corporation with swords. They had begun as earnest warrior monks guarding pilgrims in the Holy Land, but over 2 centuries they accumulated land, ships, castles, and most dangerously, liquid capital. Kings deposited treasure with them, nobles borrowed from them. They created letters of credit so a pilgrim could deposit coins in Paris and withdraw funds in Jerusalem without getting robbed on the way. Basically, medieval online banking minus Wi-Fi and plus chainmail. By the reign of King Philip IV of France, however, the French crown was catastrophically broke after wars with England and Flanders, and Philip owed the Templars staggering sums. Debt has a funny way of inspiring creativity, and Philip's creativity leaned toward eliminate the creditor. On Friday, 13th October 1307, yes, that Friday the 13th, because history loves drama, royal officials across France simultaneously arrested hundreds of Templars. The charges were theatrical: heresy, idol worship, secret initiation rites involving spitting on crosses, and kissing indecent body parts. Under torture, confessions bloomed on cue, which was less divine revelation and more human survival instinct. Philip pressured Pope Clement V, who owed his position partly to French influence, to suppress the order. The papacy hesitated, investigated, stalled, and finally dissolved the Templars in 1312, not because evidence proved cosmic evil, but because political gravity pointed one way. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned in 1314 after retracting his coerced confession, dying dramatically and allegedly cursing king and pope alike. Within a year, both men were dead, which did wonders for the legend. The conspiracy was not that the Templars secretly ruled the world. It was that a monarch engineered coordinated arrests, manipulated ecclesiastical authority, and weaponized rumor to erase his creditors. It worked. Their assets were redistributed largely to the Hospitallers, and Philip's immediate financial pressure eased. The spectacle left Europe uneasy, because if warrior monks could vanish overnight through paperwork and fire, then power clearly operated behind curtains. And once people understood that kings could choreograph reality itself, it became easier to imagine other shadows moving just out of sight. If royal debt could erase an order of warrior bankers, then papal arrogance could certainly inspire a quieter, sharper conspiracy. And in the late 13th century, Sicily became the stage for exactly that. The island had fallen under the rule of Charles of Anjou, a French prince installed with papal blessing after the violent removal of the previous dynasty. Charles ruled like a man who believed subtlety was for peasants. Taxes ballooned, French officials swaggered, Sicilians simmered, and somewhere in that simmer, a coordinated rebellion was not just whispered, but carefully organized, because revolts do not erupt across an entire island at the exact hour of evening prayer without someone planning the group chat in advance. On Easter Monday in 1282, outside a church near Palermo, a French soldier allegedly harassed a Sicilian woman. The crowd intervened. The soldier died. Church bells rang for vespers, and those bells became the signal. Across Palermo and then outward like a ripple through olive groves and port towns, Sicilians attacked French officials and soldiers with unnerving synchronicity. This was the Sicilian Vespers, and it was less spontaneous rage and more coordinated purge. Messengers had moved quietly beforehand. Alliances had been secured. The Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII had nudged events from afar, eager to destabilize Charles, who threatened his own empire. Peter III of Aragon had been contacted in advance, practically waiting offshore for his cue. Within weeks, Peter landed, claiming the Sicilian crown through his wife's lineage, because nothing says surprise uprising like a prearranged replacement king arriving on schedule. Charles was stunned. Papal fury ignited, and Europe slid into a broader war. What made the conspiracy real was not the insult outside the church. It was the orchestration behind it, the months of secret correspondence, the alignment of foreign support, the calculated timing with a religious festival when bells would mask coordination. The violence was brutal and ugly, yes, but it was also strategic. The French presence collapsed with astonishing speed. Sicily did not simply riot, it switched dynasties through covert planning and synchronized bloodshed. In the aftermath, Mediterranean politics tilted, Aragon expanded, the papacy fumed, and observers across Europe noticed something unsettling. A population could overthrow imposed rule if it conspired effectively enough. The lesson lingered in royal courts like the aftertaste of bitter wine. If bells could signal rebellion in Sicily, what might ring elsewhere? The air across Christendom felt thinner after that, as though beneath every festival hymn there might hide another carefully timed reckoning. The echo of coordinated bells in Sicily drifted northward into a continent already allergic to insecurity. And nowhere did paranoia ferment more dramatically than in 14th century France during the Black Death, when plague carts rolled through streets and people searched desperately for someone to blame besides fleas and fate. The disease arrived in 1347 and cut through towns with obscene efficiency. Bodies piled, priests muttered last rites until their voices cracked. Medical knowledge, bless it, flailed like a cat in bathwater. And into that chaos stepped a conspiracy that was not imaginary at all. The deliberate persecution of Jewish communities under the accusation that they had poisoned wells. Rumors did not appear randomly. They were circulated, encouraged, and in some regions strategically exploited by local leaders who owed debts to Jewish lenders or sought to redirect public fury. Confessions were extracted under torture, again, shocker, and evidence conveniently surfaced in places where municipal coffers could benefit from confiscated property. In 1348 and 1349, massacres erupted in cities like Strasbourg, where hundreds of Jews were burned alive despite the plague not yet having reached its peak there. Authorities sometimes attempted to shield communities, but just as often they facilitated violence. The so-called plot to poison Christendom's wells was fictitious. The coordinated seizure of assets and cancellation of obligations was very real. Town councils voided debts once creditors were dead or expelled. Entire neighborhoods were appropriated. It was opportunism wearing the mask of moral panic, and it functioned with disturbing administrative precision. Meanwhile, across the Alps in Italy, certain rulers quietly protected Jewish residents, recognizing both the injustice and the economic self-harm of exterminating taxpayers. The contrast made the manipulation clearer. This was not spontaneous hysteria alone, it was channeled. The conspiracy lay in how elites allowed, fueled, or weaponized rumor to consolidate power and wealth. Plague became pretext. And when the pandemic eventually receded, Europe had not only lost millions of lives, but had also demonstrated how quickly fear could be molded into policy. The lesson lingered like smoke in emptied quarters. If sickness could be framed as sabotage, then any crisis could be shaped into narrative. That realization seeped into royal and noble calculations, particularly in realms where succession already balanced on knife edges. In England, a young king watched nobles circle one another with barely concealed hostility, and the atmosphere felt eerily familiar. Fear, accusation, preemptive strikes. The stage was set for another very real conspiracy, this time aimed not at a minority community, but at a monarch who proved inconvenient. In 1327, England demonstrated that kings were not immune to coordinated removal, especially when they insisted on alienating nearly everyone with influence. Edward II had inherited a kingdom and treated it like a personal group project where he insisted on giving all the credit to his favorites. His close companions, first Piers Gaveston, then the Despensers, were elevated with such theatrical preference that established nobles felt sidelined and frankly insulted. Gaveston was executed by rebellious barons in 1312, which should have been a cautionary tale, but Edward doubled down with the Despensers, granting them lands and authority in Wales and beyond. Resentment fermented into something more structured. His queen, Isabella of France, initially sidelined, found herself negotiating in France in 1325 and decided, quite decisively, not to rush home. There she allied with Roger Mortimer, an exiled Marcher lord who had escaped the Tower of London in a jailbreak that honestly read like a medieval action script. Isabella and Mortimer gathered support among disaffected nobles and secured backing from Hainaut, promising a marriage alliance for the young Prince Edward. This was not emotional outrage, it was logistical preparation. Ships were arranged, troops recruited. Messaging carefully framed the invasion not as rebellion, but as liberation from evil counselors. In 1326, they landed in England to surprisingly enthusiastic support. The Despensers were captured and executed with elaborate cruelty that suggested pent-up rage had RSVP'd early. Edward II fled, was apprehended, and forced to abdicate in favor of his son. Parliament formalized it, presenting a veneer of legality that almost fooled no one. The deposed king was imprisoned at Berkeley Castle. In September 1327, he died under circumstances that immediately invited speculation. Contemporary rumors described a murder so lurid it bordered on grotesque symbolism, though modern historians debate the method. What remains clear is that his removal was not accidental. A coordinated invasion led by his own queen and her ally had dismantled his regime with chilling efficiency. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as regents for the young Edward III, congratulating themselves, perhaps prematurely, because conspiracies tend to inspire sequels. In 1330, the teenage king staged his own coup at Nottingham Castle, arresting Mortimer and later executing him. Isabella was sidelined. Power shifted again, briskly, as though the crown were a prop passed between ambitious hands. England had witnessed a queen orchestrate an invasion, depose a king, and restructure governance, all under the banner of reform. The message echoed across Europe. Monarchy was sacred in theory, negotiable in practice. If alliances aligned and narratives were polished, even a crowned head could be quietly, or not so quietly, removed from the board. By the 15th century, Italy resembled a chessboard where every piece suspected the others of hiding knives, and in Florence the knives were often metaphorical until, suddenly, they were not. The Pazzi conspiracy of 1478 unfolded In a city already humming with rivalry between elite banking families, most notably the Medici, who had converted financial leverage into political dominance with unnerving smoothness. Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano effectively steered the Florentine Republic, charming some, irritating others, and consolidating influence like men who understood both numbers and narrative. The Pazzi family, resentful and ambitious, aligned themselves with external powers who also felt sidelined, among them Pope Sixtus IV, whose own political calculations in central Italy clashed with Medici interests. Yes, a pope became entangled in a plot to remove two bankers because Renaissance politics ran on holy water and grudges in equal measure. The plan was audacious: assassinate Lorenzo and Giuliano during High Mass in Florence Cathedral on Easter Sunday, when the brothers would stand in predictable proximity and the crowd would mask the first seconds of chaos. It was a location chosen for symbolism and acoustics, because nothing says new regime loading like blood on cathedral marble. On 26 April 1478, as the host was elevated, conspirators struck. Giuliano was stabbed repeatedly and died where he fell. Lorenzo was wounded, but managed to barricade himself in the sacristy. Outside, attempts to seize key government buildings faltered. The coup required seamless coordination. Instead, it unraveled like badly stitched velvet. Florentines rallied behind the Medici with ferocious loyalty, and within hours, the conspirators found themselves hunted. Francesco de' Pazzi was captured and hanged from the Palazzo della Signoria windows. Others followed, dangling as very public caution signs. The Archbishop of Pisa, who had participated, was not spared. Apparently, ecclesiastical rank did not come with a conspiracy warranty. Pope Sixtus IV denied direct orchestration, yet entered into open conflict with Florence shortly afterward, which did little to quiet suspicions. What made the Pazzi episode a true conspiracy was the documented coordination among a rival family, papal interests, and external rulers to physically eliminate Florence's de facto leaders in a single choreographed strike. It failed spectacularly, but failure did not erase intent. Instead, it strengthened Lorenzo's position, allowing him to present himself as the city's near-miraculous survivor. In the aftermath, Florence tightened internal security, alliances shifted, and the Medici myth expanded. The cathedral's echo of steel against bone lingered as proof that even in cities of art and poetry, power contests were resolved with daggers first, sonnets later. While Florence reeled from cathedral bloodstains, farther east the Byzantine Empire perfected conspiracies as if they were a competitive sport with lifetime appointments as the prize. By the 11th century, Constantinople shimmered with ceremony and silk, but beneath the gold mosaics, the imperial court resembled a polite dinner party where everyone had already Googled poison recipes. Emperors rose and fell not just through battlefield defeat, but through coordinated whispers, forged alliances, and strategic blinding, because apparently sight was optional, but ambition was mandatory. Consider the overthrow of Romanos thwarted Diogenes in 1071, which unfolded after the catastrophic defeat at Manzikert. Military disaster alone did not dethrone him. Political rivals in the capital seized the opportunity like opportunists spotting an unattended crown. The Ducas family maneuvered swiftly, spreading the narrative that Romanos's leadership had doomed the empire. While he attempted to regroup, letters circulated, loyalties shifted, and once he returned, he found the gates effectively closed. He was arrested, deposed, and ultimately blinded, an act that was technically framed as merciful because killing a former emperor was messy, but permanently removing his ability to rule, that was considered tasteful. The coordination required to replace him with Michael VII Ducas involved aristocratic factions aligning interests with almost corporate efficiency. Later centuries refined the formula. In 1185, Andronikos I Komnenos seized power after cultivating populist support against a regency he painted as corrupt and foreign-influenced. He entered Constantinople theatrically, presenting himself as reformer-in-chief, only to govern with paranoia dialed to 11. Executions multiplied. Trust evaporated. Unsurprisingly, another conspiracy brewed, and he was overthrown and brutally killed by a mob that decided his vibe was no longer acceptable. The Byzantine pattern was not random instability. It was a political ecosystem where elite families, military commanders, and court officials regularly coordinated to install or remove rulers when expedient. Legitimacy was flexible, lineage negotiable, survival conditional, blinding, exile to monasteries, forced abdications. These were procedural tools. What made these episodes genuine conspiracies was the documentation of secret councils, prearranged military support, and calculated timing to coincide with imperial absence or weakness. Constantinople's walls were formidable against foreign siege engines, yet within those walls, power shifted through quieter sieges of influence. Observers from Western Europe often described the Byzantines as duplicitous, which was rich coming from societies that had just stabbed bankers during Mass. In truth, the empire simply institutionalized intrigue, and as crusaders later marched through Byzantine territory, carrying their own agendas, they entered a world already fluent in backstage politics, a fluency that would soon collide disastrously with Western ambition. By the late 15th century, England's royal court had learned to treat conspiracies like a subscription service. Pay attention, or your head might be next. Henry VII, having won the crown at Bosworth Field in 1485, understood that legitimacy alone didn't prevent ambitious relatives from trying their luck, especially when pretenders with foreign backing popped up like malware on a medieval motherboard. The Lambert Simnel episode in 1487 was textbook. A boy coached by Yorkist loyalists and passed off as Edward, Earl of Warwick, toured Ireland and continental courts, gathering funding and soldiers with a straight face that only slightly suggested child actor in political drama. Henry responded with a mix of pragmatism and snark, letting Simnel live in the royal kitchens after the rebellion was crushed, which was either magnanimous or lazy, depending on your preference for suspense. 2 years later, Perkin Warbeck tried the same trick, claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, one of the princes in the Tower. Backed by Margaret of Burgundy and other continental players, he landed troops, coordinated uprisings, and even fooled a few minor nobles into open rebellion. It nearly worked, because when you have multiple foreign courts quietly coordinating logistics, bribing local supporters, and lending ships, conspiracies can feel inevitable, like that one series you just can't stop binging. Warbeck's eventual capture and execution was less a surprise than a carefully timed conclusion, signaling to everyone that Henry would tolerate creative ambition only in fiction or on stage. These events reflected more than personal paranoia. They exposed how communication, timing, and selective loyalty could make even a minor claimant a credible threat. The conspirators orchestrated across borders, leveraging allies in Ireland, the Low Countries, and Scotland, demonstrating that political plotting was not bound by geography. England's citizens, who might have enjoyed a quiet life of taxes and sermons, found themselves pawns in a network of rumor, money, and armed force. Every rebellion underscored the fragility of authority. Kings could be toppled not just by open battle, but through careful orchestration of perception and support. Lessons were brutal but clear. Legitimacy was performative, and survival depended on preempting plots that often moved faster than armies. The networked approach of these pretenders resembled a medieval LinkedIn for the ambitious and the duplicitous, where signals of credibility, patronage, and timing determined whether a conspiracy would succeed or fizzle. Henry VII, having survived multiple iterations, became a master of counterintelligence, rewarding loyalty and surveilling potential plots with obsessive precision. His court security measures, alliances, and punitive examples set the standard for early Tudor governance. Intrigue, bribery, foreign alliances, and misrepresentation all coalesced into genuine conspiracies that shook England without ever necessarily spilling large-scale blood in open battle. Power in this era was a performance piece, and conspiracies were just increasingly complex choreography, sometimes tragic, sometimes farcical, but always chilling in their execution. Meanwhile, in the Holy Roman Empire, the art of political sabotage had evolved into something resembling corporate espionage, but with more axes and fewer HR complaints. In 1400s, Germany, princes, bishops, and electors constantly jockeyed for influence over the emperor, who often resembled a figurehead more than a sovereign, and conspiracies were their currency. One notable episode unfolded around the election of Sigismund of Luxembourg as King of the Romans in 1411. Various factions, dissatisfied with his growing influence, plotted to undermine him before his coronation, distributing forged letters, spreading slander, and maneuvering allies in strategically distant principalities so that when he traveled to claim his title, the welcome committees might instead stage a polite kidnapping. This was not mere rumor. It involved coordination across hundreds of miles, with messengers riding in all weather, because emails and telegraphs had not yet been invented, obviously. The conspirators assumed that if they could delay or prevent the ceremonial endorsement of his kingship, they could install a more pliable candidate or at least extract concessions. Sigismund, however, had an uncanny knack for reading intentions. He traveled with spies of his own, intercepted communications, and subtly bribed key electors, turning potential traps into public humiliations for his enemies. The conspirators' plans unraveled spectacularly, with alliances shifting mid-mission and even some plots accidentally exposing the identities of would-be traitors. Political assassination and deception in this environment were as much about optics as execution. The emperor, who could survive whispers and forged letters, earned legitimacy by default. Meanwhile, urban centers like Nuremberg and Augsburg watched the drama unfold with fascination, noting that nobles with swords and titles could be outmaneuvered by strategy, gossip, and timing, not brute force. The episode reinforced a principle medieval European elites understood all too well. Power could be lost to invisible networks as efficiently as to an invading army, and conspiracies, if well coordinated, were terrifyingly effective. Subsequent plots during Sigismund's reign, including intrigues surrounding the Council of Constance, followed similar patterns. Secret negotiations, strategic marriages, and timing attacks to coincide with major religious or political events. Conspiracies in this sense were living organisms, constantly adapting, feeding on ambition, and exploiting the smallest weakness. As Europe careened toward the Hussite wars and increasing dynastic tensions, these mechanisms only became more refined. The lesson was clear. In the Holy Roman Empire, one did not simply plot in secret. One plotted with precision, patience, and an understanding that any misstep could result in exile, imprisonment, or an embarrassingly visible execution that reminded everyone else why subtlety matters. The environment was a chessboard where pawns often moved themselves. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the French court was busy proving that conspiring wasn't just a hobby, it was practically a national sport. Louis XI, who ascended in 1461, had the subtle charm of a spider in a silk shop, soft words, cold calculation, and a knack for ensuring rivals stepped right into traps they didn't see coming. His reign was littered with plots, betrayals, and alliances that shifted faster than court fashions. One particularly juicy episode involved Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, whose ambitions threatened to dwarf France itself. Louis invited Charles to negotiate peace and shared interests, all while quietly cultivating a network of spies, informants, and double agents that penetrated Burgundian circles. Messages were intercepted, loyalties tested, and whispers of rebellion were amplified just enough to make Charles second-guess every step. Meanwhile, Louis funded rebellions in Burgundy's territories, subtly undermining Charles's authority without open confrontation. The masterstroke came when Louis lured Charles into negotiations that were less about treaties and more about orchestrated misdirection. By dangling political carrots, isolating allies, and timing moves with precision, Louis forced Burgundy into concessions without drawing a sword. The entire affair, meticulously chronicled by contemporaries, revealed the depth of coordination required. It wasn't mere court intrigue, it was asymmetrical warfare via psychology, finance, and gossip. Nobles found themselves questioning whom to trust, clergy wondered whose prayers really mattered, and merchants calculated which side of the rumor would benefit their ledgers. The conspiracy was invisible in many ways. No dramatic assassinations or public executions were required, just the careful manipulation of perception and the patient orchestration of fear, loyalty, and timing. By the time open hostility flared, Charles had already been weakened from within, illustrating that some conspiracies functioned like pressure cookers rather than sledgehammers. Louis's tactics highlighted a growing sophistication in late medieval power plays. Destabilization, intelligence, and preemptive strikes replaced the earlier reliance on brute force. Subsequent monarchs, both in France and across Europe, took note. Courtiers learned that loyalty was negotiable, and public statements were often theater masking real maneuvering. Conspiracies no longer needed daggers or poison. They required networks, patience, and the ability to predict human behavior across multiple courts. In essence, Louis XV turned paranoia into policy, demonstrating that survival and success often depended on the silent orchestration of events before the first official order was ever signed. Observers of the time may have called him cunning, devious, or mad, but the results were unambiguous. Power, in the late medieval period, was as much about preemptive plotting as it was about bloodlines. Every alliance, letter, and friendly negotiation could hide a centuries-long game of chess where one wrong move could mean exile, imprisonment, or simply vanishing from history's radar entirely. By the early 16th century, the Italian peninsula had turned into a live-action game of Risk, except everyone was armed, cunning, and occasionally ecclesiastical. The Borgia family, led by Rodrigo Borgia, soon to become Pope Alexander VI, perfected the art of conspiracies with a flair for both theatrics and terror. Rodrigo's rise was not accidental. It involved bribery, manipulation of papal elections, and a consistent willingness to weaponize rumor and rumor mongers. His children, Cesare, Lucrezia, and the less famous siblings, were trained in politics, seduction, and strategic cruelty, making them practically a Renaissance version of a startup's aggressive management team, but with poison and daggers instead of spreadsheets. Cesare Borgia, in particular, demonstrated that removing rivals could be both efficient and theatrical. He orchestrated assassinations of condottieri, arranged sudden executions of political allies who fell out of favor, and subtly encouraged feuds among competing Italian states, allowing him to consolidate territories under the guise of papal authority. Perhaps the most infamous episode was the murder of Giovanni Sforza's allies and the mysterious deaths of certain nobles who resisted Borgia dominance, each event meticulously timed to coincide with festivals or public celebrations so that witnesses were distracted, morality was ambiguous, and gossip did most of the work. Rumor and fear functioned as equal partners in these conspiracies. A single whisper of Cesare's wrath could dissolve resistance before any sword was drawn. Meanwhile, Lucretia's marriages were tools of diplomacy and manipulation, with alliances arranged to strengthen papal influence, while subtly undermining rivals, proving that conspiracies were not only violent, they were marital, financial, and theatrical. Even the Vatican itself became a theater of intrigue, where cardinals engaged in secret plots, leveraged church law creatively, and occasionally disappeared under suspicious circumstances, all in the name of consolidating influence over the Italian states. The Borgia's reign highlighted a new level of sophistication in conspiratorial thinking. It was no longer sufficient to overthrow or assassinate. Success demanded optics, timing, narrative control, and strategic marriages. Contemporaries recorded these events with awe and disgust, emphasizing both the brilliance and the moral bankruptcy of the family, whose methods inspired fear far beyond Italy. As other European courts watched, they understood that ambition was not enough. One needed networks, intelligence, and the willingness to exploit both legal and extra-legal mechanisms to survive. In short, conspiracies had evolved into multi-layered operations that combined murder, diplomacy, rumor, and careful orchestration of perception, turning politics into an elaborate performance where the actors often doubled as villains, and failure meant oblivion. Meanwhile, in Scotland, conspiracies wore kilts and carried axes, sometimes literally, proving that ambition was a universal language. In 1502, the tension between James IV and rebellious nobles reached a boiling point, fueled by long-standing feuds, contested claims, and the occasional grudge that had lingered like bad haggis. One particularly notable plot involved the powerful Douglas family, whose members felt increasingly sidelined by the king's consolidation of authority. The conspirators communicated through letters disguised as mundane business or church correspondence, recruited loyal retainers, and timed moves to coincide with court gatherings when the king's attention was divided and ceremonial distractions were at their peak. The plan? Kidnap or neutralize the king, assert Douglas influence, and reshape governance from behind the scenes. As with many true conspiracies, the operation hinged on precise timing, secrecy, and confidence in human psychology. One slip-up would trigger panic or preemptive strikes. James, however, had learned from the European playbook, employing a network of informants, double agents, and carefully placed retainers who fed him intelligence that gradually exposed the plot. The conspirators, realizing they had been compromised, attempted improvisation, but spontaneity rarely substitutes for months of planning. Arrests followed swiftly, and executions were carried out with a mix of public theater and grim efficiency meant to deter imitators. What made this plot historically significant was the documented coordination among noble families, the use of coded communication, and the interplay between personal vendetta and political ambition, all taking place in a society where loyalty was negotiable and alliances were fragile. Scotland, often overlooked in grand European narratives, demonstrated that conspiracies were a transnational phenomenon, influenced by tactics observed abroad and adapted to local power structures. The outcome reinforced royal authority, but also left lingering mistrust among the nobility, proving that even when a conspiracy fails, its psychological impact can ripple for decades. James IV's reign, strengthened by foiling the plot, showcased the delicate balance between centralized power and aristocratic privilege, a tension that would fuel future intrigues and rebellions. True conspiracies, therefore, were not merely violent acts. They were complex social operations, requiring intelligence, timing, and the ability to manipulate perception. They left tangible marks on governance, law, and the personal relationships of rulers and nobles alike, demonstrating that ambition, when organized and coordinated, could threaten thrones even without open war. The Douglas episode became a case study for historians and contemporaries alike, a blueprint showing how aristocratic ambition, communication, and opportunistic timing could coalesce into a genuine, historically verifiable conspiracy with long-lasting consequences. Finally, the late medieval period offered a masterclass in conspiracies that blended ambition, religion, and international intrigue in the court of France during the reign of Charles VIII and Louis XIV. By the 1490s, Italy was the playground where French kings could try their luck, and local states had perfected subtle forms of betrayal like Renaissance prose. The infamous Pazzi-style mentality resurfaced as foreign powers courted Italian princes, offering troops, gold, and promises of protection to anyone willing to undermine rivals. Charles VIII's invasion of Italy in 1494, aimed at claiming Naples, provided fertile ground for conspiracies both obvious and hidden. French nobles conspired to secure personal gain by influencing which Italian alliances would support or oppose the campaign, while Italian states, aware of France's ambitions, plotted counteractions to maximize their autonomy. Diplomacy was a minefield of secret letters, bribes, false assurances, and carefully timed betrayals, with every city-state maintaining networks of informants to monitor both allies and enemies. The result was a chaotic dance of maneuvering, where trust was as scarce as honest coin, and betrayal as routine as courtly etiquette. Simultaneously, internal conspiracies in France ensured that kings remained vigilant. Plots to replace advisors, control succession, or manipulate war funding required constant monitoring, often through spies embedded in the royal household, merchants' guilds, and even ecclesiastical offices. By Louis XIV's accession, this tradition of plotting had become institutionalized. Conspiracies were no longer sporadic acts of ambition, but recurring mechanisms through which political objectives could be pursued without open war. Observers recorded assassinations, prearranged marriages, secret alliances, and opportunistic rebellions, demonstrating that coordination, timing, and deception had become essential tools of power. The interplay of domestic and foreign conspiracies created a world where rulers, generals, and courtiers could rarely afford complacency. Even ceremonial events might conceal a hidden agenda. Ultimately, the late medieval era confirmed that conspiracies were both inevitable and effective. When ambition intersected with weak communication channels, fragile loyalties, and overlapping jurisdictions, the conditions were perfect for coordinated plots that could alter the course of history. Across Europe, from Templar suppression to Sicilian uprisings, from English pretenders to Byzantine coups, the lesson was consistent. Power was never guaranteed, legitimacy was negotiable, and those who underestimated the ingenuity of conspirators often paid with blood, influence, or both. The documented conspiracies of the medieval period thus form a tapestry of intrigue that reveals the human tendency to manipulate, deceive, and coordinate sometimes on a scale so large that the consequences echoed for generations, shaping monarchies, republics, and empires alike. Europe's late medieval courts were theaters where ambition, paranoia, and strategy intertwined, leaving behind a legacy that reminds us when people truly want something, especially power, they will plot, plan, and execute with a sophistication that rivals modern intelligence agencies. History remembers not just the kings who ruled, but the conspiracies that defined their reigns, proving that the shadows often mattered as much as the throne itself. Knightly swagger and oaths nobody read. In the early medieval period, knights strutted around in shiny armor like they were auditioning for the original version of Instagram, swearing oaths that few could have possibly remembered beyond the first syllable. They pledged loyalty to lords, defended the helpless, and promised to uphold justice, though honestly, half of them probably forgot which lord they were supposed to serve within a week, and justice was often interpreted as beat the guy with the bigger sword first. The oaths were long, full of flowery Latin nobody spoke, and delivered in ceremonies that looked suspiciously like excuses for everyone to wear their fanciest tunics and eat way too much bread pudding. Some knights took their vows very seriously, practicing daily horsemanship drills and memorizing moral codes, while others viewed chivalry like a checklist you could ignore whenever more convenient, which, spoiler alert, was most of the time. There was this bizarre tension between the ideal of being a paragon of virtue and the reality that human laziness and ego were just too strong. And the church, which sponsored most of these oaths, was more than willing to nod approvingly, while quietly hoping the knight in question didn't accidentally get himself killed before the next sermon. Meanwhile, ladies, pages, and squires were expected to nod politely, occasionally swoon, and remember which knight owed them gratitude for past heroics, even if that heroism was mostly about showing up on a horse, yelling a bit, and maybe accidentally poking an enemy in the ribs. Letters and poetry circulated among the literate knights and nobles, reminding them how virtuous they were supposed to be, often accompanied by illustrations of knights kneeling with overly dramatic halos around their helmets. Honestly, it looked like Photoshop medieval edition, and yet even in this carefully curated spectacle, vows were broken with remarkable frequency. Alliances shifted like the wind. Promises to protect the weak often came after the weak were already in the ground, and feuds over who got the bigger slice of pie at banquets were sometimes treated as matters of divine importance. In the end, chivalry was part branding exercise, part moral experiment, and entirely human, which meant it came with all the contradictions, laziness, and occasional brilliance you'd expect from a bunch of young men in pointy boots trying to look noble while mostly being hungry and ambitious. So, while knights swore, the universe mostly shrugged, and history would eventually laugh hard. Armor, horses, and flexing honor points. Knights quickly realized that chivalry had a lot less to do with moral fiber and a lot more with optics, and the size of one's horse became an unofficial scoreboard for virtue, because nothing says honorable like a destrier that costs more than a small village. Armor was both practical and performative, polished until it gleamed in sunlight, heavy enough to make everyday chores impossible, and designed to intimidate anyone who might even think about questioning your honor, or your Instagram-worthy flex, if medieval Instagram had existed. Riding into town or onto a battlefield, a knight's presence alone broadcasted wealth, strength, and moral commitment, and everyone nodded, pretending they weren't calculating which of the shiny cuirasses they'd want in a fight. The really serious knights spent years practicing swordplay, jousting, and horseback acrobatics, mostly to earn bragging rights at tournaments, but they peppered every skill with the language of virtue. I fight for justice. they'd say, while expertly skewering a rival in a spectacle meant for the crowd to gasp. And yet, the spectacle often outshone substance. Armor scratched, helmets fogged, and some knights struggled to mount their own horses without help, which is hilarious when you imagine someone promising heroic deeds while flailing awkwardly in the saddle. Horses became status symbols, companions, and occasional co-conspirators, because a horse could run faster than the knight in full armor could think, making it possible to escape situations that vaguely resembled moral dilemmas. Squires and pages had to memorize not only horsemanship and combat techniques, but also which knight had the most clout in every town, because political maneuvering was just as critical as any sword swing. Meanwhile, chroniclers, scribes, and poets ensured that every maneuver, joust, or awkward stumble was recorded with exaggerated heroism, so that future generations could read about valor, totally ignoring that the knight probably tripped over his own spurs mid-rescue. Wealth, armor, and horses together created a complicated economy of perceived honor, and the code of chivalry, at least in public, demanded that knights protect the helpless, serve their lord, and uphold justice. But the unspoken rule was that you could fudge the details as long as your horse looked impressive, your armor sparkled, and your name survived the minstrel's song. Basically, medieval life had a leaderboard system with morality points disguised as pageantry, and everyone playing along, even if some of those points were technically imaginary. Damsels, drama, and questionable rescue skills. The whole knights rescuing damsels thing often looked less like gallant heroism and more like accidental property retrieval with dramatic flair, because if you're honest, many ladies weren't in mortal peril at all. They were sometimes just mildly inconvenienced, locked in a tower by bored relatives, or participating in a family feud that had nothing to do with the nearest sword wielder. Knights would ride in, waving lances, shouting battle cries that echoed for miles, and sometimes literally trip over the very moat they intended to cross. Yet somehow the story emerged as a heroic rescue. Poetry, chronicles, and tapestries exaggerated every detail, turning minor inconveniences into life or death events, because medieval audiences loved drama, especially when it involved shiny helmets and swooning. And let's be real, vows to protect the helpless were often overridden by fashion and ego, armor that looked impressive but barely let you swing a sword meant some knights were more likely to hurt themselves than the villain. Sometimes a knight would fall in love mid-rescue, entirely forgetting that his primary mission was to liberate someone, and the lady in question occasionally had to rescue herself because the knight was tangled in a banner, or worse, lost his horse. Meanwhile, ladies were expected to swoon politely and write flowery letters praising courage, though many were perfectly capable of planning their own escapes or negotiating politically without knightly interference. Still, the idea of chivalry required that knights perform these grand gestures whether or not they were actually necessary, which created a bizarre feedback loop of virtue signaling. The more visible the rescue, the more points earned in the imaginary honor economy. Pages and squires observed, learned, and sometimes laughed quietly at the chaos, knowing full well that reality rarely matched the tales they would someday recite to the next generation. Humor, danger, and social pressure all collided in these moments, making each so-called rescue a mix of competence, luck, and accidental comedy. And yet, the audience, the court, the chroniclers, the local villagers, was essential. Without someone to witness heroism, even the most daring deeds were worthless in the chivalric ledger. Over time, The damsel in distress became a cultural meme, idealized in stories far more than it existed in real life. A perfect example of medieval PR at work. The performance mattered more than the facts. Even when knights failed spectacularly, the tales often reframed the failures as bravery, because admitting incompetence was basically unthinkable when your entire social identity revolved around vows of honor. So, rescues became theater, romance, and mild disaster all at once, and nobody ever admitted how often the drama was manufactured for appearances. Feasts, favors, and betrayal snacks. Medieval banquets were less about nutrition and more about signaling status, testing patience, and occasionally betraying a friend with a side of roast boar. Knights, lords, and ladies gathered to eat, drink, and exchange oaths over wine goblets that were often half spilled, fully symbolic, and dangerously close to starting a fight over seating arrangements. Promises made at the table were treated with dramatic seriousness in the moment, pledges of loyalty, support, or revenge, but by dessert, many of those vows had already mutated into something resembling polite fiction, because wine lowers inhibitions and medieval storytelling demanded flair. Some knights genuinely meant every word, practicing moral consistency like a high-stakes game, while others verbally agreed to anything if it increased favor, guaranteed a future dowry, or just bought a few minutes of peace. Interestingly, bread could be used as a passive-aggressive weapon. A crumb tossed carelessly, a fork jabbed too close, and suddenly a minor social slight became a justification for a duel tomorrow. Favors were currency in themselves. A handshake could be recorded in memory as sacred, though in practice, loyalty was fluid and sometimes negotiable with a better horse or a louder trumpet. Chroniclers, who often attended these feasts, documented the gestures with exaggerated reverence, describing every wink, bow, and toast as if history itself depended on it, while the real negotiations, threats, and betrayals usually happened quietly in shadowed corners over extra goblets of mead no one noticed. Humor, irony, and the occasional knife hidden under the table punctuated these interactions, because medieval life had a subtle way of reminding everyone that vows were only as strong as the person's next craving or ambition. In some cases, a promise could be made and broken in the same hour, with minimal social repercussion beyond embarrassment, though gossip ensured the event would live forever in local lore. The contrast between public performance and private reality was striking. Knights could swear undying loyalty, yet later march against the same ally, convinced they were still technically honorable because they'd been polite when swearing the vow. Feasts became the ultimate test of chivalric flexibility. How many promises could you juggle before someone noticed the inconsistencies? And of course, dessert often arrived as an afterthought, highlighting the absurdity. While people argued over alliances and honor, fruit tarts cooled, untouched, a quiet witness to human folly. By the end, the room smelled of roasted meat, spilled wine, and betrayal, with everyone nodding, smiling, and pretending that decorum matched reality. In essence, medieval feasts were like reality shows, with better lighting and worse dental hygiene, and the code of chivalry sometimes survived, but mostly as garnish. Tournaments, glitter, bruises, and fake loyalty. Tournaments were the medieval version of a flex reel, a place where knights could publicly prove their honor while also testing the limits of their helmets and patience, and the audience absolutely ate it up. Jousts, melees, and displays of swordsmanship were billed as demonstrations of virtue, courage, and skill, but mostly they were about looking spectacular while taking massive risks for applause, adoration, and occasionally a fancy ribbon. Knights practiced for months, sometimes years, learning to ride straight, aim true, and nod heroically after accidentally bopping someone in the face. Points of honor were awarded inconsistently, often influenced by who knew the loudest trumpeter or who smiled the best while bleeding, which created a strange hierarchy where charisma occasionally outweighed competence. Loyalty, too, became performative. Alliances formed and broke mid-tournament. Promises made in the heat of competition evaporated as soon as a rival knight offered a more impressive horse or a bigger entourage. The spectacle was messy, chaotic, and oddly democratic. Anyone could witness courage or humiliation, and the stories were immortalized by chroniclers who had an obvious soft spot for exaggeration. Bruises, broken lances, and mangled helmets were badges of honor, evidence that you tried hard, even if the try involved tripping over your own feet, losing your horse, or accidentally knocking over your best friend. Audience reactions mattered more than the technicality of rules. Applause often determined who was remembered and who quietly limped home, plotting revenge or a more photogenic comeback. Meanwhile, knights tried to maintain dignity while interacting with their peers, which meant winking, bowing, and throwing charming insults mid-fight, all recorded in careful narrative to make them look simultaneously heroic and witty. And of course, ladies of the court watched, praised, and occasionally awarded favors that could be used as social currency, which only made the performance more intense. Tournaments became a feedback loop. The more extravagant your failures, the more people laughed, gasped, and remembered you. So some knights leaned into theatrics, pretending their skill matched the drama. Secret grudges, unspoken competitions, and the thrill of public judgment transformed these events from mere martial practice into elaborate theater, blurring the line between honor, entertainment, and sheer chaos. By the end of the day, everyone had a story, some heroic, some tragic, some completely fabricated, and the code of chivalry, while invoked loudly, was more about optics and reputation than actual moral consistency. Glitter, bruises, and fake loyalty ruled the field, and history remembers the spectacle more than the substance. Secret deals behind the chapel curtains. The whole God sees all part of chivalry was wildly optimistic, because behind closed doors, knights and nobles treated moral vows like optional DLC, negotiating favors, marriages, and betrayals with surgical precision. Chapels and private chambers became informal offices where whispered agreements could upend entire regions, and the clergy, who were supposed to witness virtue, often nodded politely while mentally cataloging who was bending the rules this week. A knight might kneel, swear loyalty, and promise protection to a lord in the morning, then slip into a side corridor to negotiate a better deal with the rival faction, assuming no one was looking. Spoiler alert, someone was always looking. Letters, secret messengers, and coded symbols in the margins of illuminated manuscripts ensured deals could be arranged without public scandal, which was essential because a public breach of oath was considered dishonorable, even if a private one could win you a castle. Some knights mastered this double life, delivering speeches in the chapel full of earnest piety, while their actions betrayed their words within the hour. The absurdity escalated when a vow to God was tangled with a vow to a friend, a lady, or a political ally. Suddenly, the moral ledger was full of contradictions that only scribes, chroniclers, and eventually historians would untangle. Humor emerged in these scenarios, over-the-top gestures, solemn nods, and dramatic handshakes, all layered over completely self-serving intentions, and participants often joked quietly with each other about who would get caught first. Secret deals weren't inherently evil. They were a survival mechanism in a world where loyalties shifted daily, and the consequences for visible betrayal were dire. Still, The frequency and creativity of these clandestine agreements made the lofty ideals of chivalry look more like a stage set than a real moral compass. Every private transaction required careful calculation: who might overhear, what rumor might spread, and how to preserve an appearance of honor while advancing personal interests. Pages and squires observed the delicate balancing act, often bewildered by the hypocrisy, yet learning that survival in a knightly hierarchy demanded flexibility, cunning, and occasional creative reinterpretation of a vow. The tension between sacred promise and human ambition created a social dance that was equal parts thrilling, terrifying, and ridiculous, and it underlined a persistent truth. Chivalry, like fashion, looked best when viewed from a distance, because the backstage chaos was almost always too messy to admire directly. In the end, the chapel curtains concealed not just whispered secrets, but the fascinating contradictions that made medieval morality as performative as it was fragile, and history would never tire of documenting the elaborate, often hilarious ingenuity of those navigating it. The fall of grand promises and ego trips. Vows, no matter how grand or theatrically sworn, had a way of collapsing under the weight of ambition, laziness, or plain bad luck, and medieval knights discovered this faster than anyone liked to admit. A pledge to defend a neighbor's castle could dissolve the moment a richer lord waved a handful of coins, a slightly larger horse, or a flashier plume in their direction. Ego trips were standard issue. Knights needed to look heroic, clever, and morally superior simultaneously, which often meant exaggerating victories, minimizing failures, and occasionally forgetting exactly what they had promised in the first place. Some broke vows for love, some for profit, and others for the sheer thrill of chaos. All of it was recorded, whether by a scribe with a flair for drama or by a bard whose imagination doubled the stakes for entertainment. Betrayal often followed predictable patterns. A knight swore loyalty publicly, then privately sabotaged allies in ways that would be explained later as strategic necessity or misunderstood honor, and somehow this reasoning satisfied most audiences. The irony wasn't lost on contemporaries who whispered, gossiped, and sometimes laughed at the audacity, even if they outwardly nodded at the knight's supposed integrity. Grand promises made in candlelit halls were fragile things, like delicate goblets filled with mead. A careless tilt, and they shattered, leaving a sticky, regrettable mess. Some knights, aware of their own fallibility, developed reputations as unreliable but flamboyant figures, performing spectacular feats while the underlying motives were entirely selfish. Yet history remembered the spectacle more than the deception. When feuds escalated, alliances shifted, and the chain of broken vows grew, entire regions witnessed the collapse of what was supposed to be moral order, replaced by a chaotic tangle of personal ambition, public image, and occasional heroism that got lucky. Ego, of course, was the main driver. No knight wanted to admit that a minor act of cowardice, forgetfulness, or opportunism could tarnish a reputation carefully built over years. So they doubled down, elaborating stories, commissioning tapestries, or sending letters praising their own gallantry, all while quietly rewriting history in their favor. What's fascinating is how quickly society normalized this contradiction. Knights were expected to fail occasionally, and their failures became material for poetry, drama, and gossip, reinforcing a culture where moral perfection was aspirational but never really expected. By the end, the grand promises, the oaths, and the heroic speeches often existed more as narrative props than enforceable ethics, a kind of moral theater with real-world consequences, yet almost always performed with the bravado of someone who believed the performance itself was sufficient. Chivalry, at this stage, was less a code and more an elaborate meme of medieval human nature, flashy, contradictory, and endlessly entertaining for those who watched closely. Legends versus reality. Chivalry's memeable afterlife. As centuries passed, the messy, contradictory, and often hilarious reality of chivalry got polished into the kind of legend that made knights look flawless, moral, and eternally heroic, which, if anyone paid attention to the original records, was wildly inaccurate. Storytellers, poets, and eventually historians curated these tales with a mix of admiration, marketing, and straight-up imagination, turning clumsy jousts, accidental rescues, and secret deals into epic narratives of virtue. Heroes who tripped over their own armor were depicted as fearless warriors, while entire battles lost due to miscommunication were recast as examples of clever strategy or divine favor. Chroniclers ignored the spilled wine, the bribes, and the ego trips because medieval audiences apparently preferred inspiration over inconvenient facts, a trend that continues today in the same way people share highlight reels and ignore the messy behind the scenes. These legends became cultural memes before memes were even a thing. Knights, ladies, dragons, and damsels circulated in stories, tapestries, and later books, creating a simplified moral universe where every oath had meaning and every sword swing had purpose. In reality, the code of chivalry was often more like a suggestion box with optional rules, heavily influenced by context, temperament, and opportunity. Modern eyes can't help but chuckle. Vows were broken, alliances flipped faster than a coin, and rescue missions often involved less gallantry than a confused shuffle across a courtyard. Yet the allure of the legend endured because humans crave narratives that are cleaner, tighter, and more inspirational than actual history, and chivalry provided an almost perfect template for heroism, romance, and drama. Over time, this selective memory transformed knights into icons, moral guides, and occasionally memeable archetypes, while the gritty, inconvenient truth of human ambition, laziness, and error faded into footnotes or was ignored entirely. The contrast is absurd and entertaining. What really happened? Flawed humans, chaotic politics, frequent mistakes, versus what people chose to remember, epic valor, unwavering virtue, and perfectly timed heroism. Even today, movies, books, and video games lean heavily on the curated version, perpetuating the idea that chivalry was a consistent moral code rather than a complex, often ridiculous social performance. And perhaps that's the ultimate charm of it. Chivalry survives, not because knights were perfect, but because humans loved the story of perfection, even if it never really existed. The memes of the Middle Ages, carried forward in legend, remind us that history is never just what happened. It's what we choose to admire, laugh at, and retell, often with dramatic embellishment and ironic reverence. In that sense, chivalry's afterlife is both absurd and poetic, a mirror of humanity's enduring love for narratives that make sense of chaos, honor outshine ego, and yes, occasionally let a clumsy knight look heroic while tripping over his own horse.